I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, became a vegetarian when I was 22. I managed my type 1 diabetes pretty well. Back then, they said, don't ever eat anything with sugar in it. And I didn't. I heard about this woman who had a son who was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, and she fed him a raw vegan diet, and he never had to take insulin. I went on a raw vegan diet. I think I didn't do too bad on it. I never ate fruit, and I still did low carb. I had a raw food snack company for 5 years. I was pretty famous in the movement. It was a fun time, but people around me and my husband, they were all getting rotten teeth because of how much fruit you eat on this diet and that you're not getting enough nutrients. All I got was sore joints. Lucky me.
Okay, good morning, everybody. Hopefully everybody's doing well. It's good to see everybody. Happy Friday. This month is National Diabetes Month, and so we have a very good guest for this today. We have Aimee here today. Aimee, it's wonderful to see you again. We shared a meal a couple of years ago back in California with Aimee and her late husband Dennis, and I got to meet her personally, so it's good to be able to see you again. Aimee, good to see you. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great.
Where are you at again? I can't remember where you guys are from.
Southern Maine.
Southern Maine. Okay, that's right. That's not a lot of people from Southern Maine that I've met before, but anyway, so I guess we'll get into it. You are a type 1 diabetic. You've been so for, I don't know, a long time, I guess. I can't remember how long it was. And well, why don't you go ahead and just kind of give us your little background, if you don't mind.
Okay. All right. So I am 68 years old. So this is going to be way in the past. I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes in 1971, 51 years ago. Wow. When I was 16. And now I believe it might have been caused by a course of tetracycline antibiotics that I took for acne. But I also had a lot of operations when I was a kid and not terribly healthy. So who knows what it was caused from. But anyway, I became a vegetarian when I was 22. And I managed my type 1 diabetes pretty well, although back then we were only on one shot a day. And then when I had 3 kids, they were really healthy, no problems. When I was 40, I started developing frozen shoulders, frozen hips, something called stiff man syndrome. And I started researching. Of course, we didn't have Google back then. That was 1996. I started researching in medical libraries. I couldn't find anything. It wasn't a well-known diabetes complication. I didn't find out until much later that it is a diabetes complication, but they didn't know that back then. So a friend sent me an article about frozen shoulder being a result of high blood sugars. It was written by Dr. Richard Bernstein. And at the end of the article, there was an offer for cassette tapes of his plan. I got the cassette tapes, listened to them, and the very next day I went low carb and on 5 shots a day. And his book, Diabetes Solution, came out a few months later, I believe in September, maybe. That it was June 2nd that I started low carb. And in about 3 weeks, all the stiffness and the frozen joints completely disappeared just by changing to a low carb diet. No grains. And actually, I had forgotten to mention that back then in 1971, when I was diagnosed, they said, don't ever eat anything with sugar in it. And I didn't. But even though, so anyway, I'll get back to the story of Dr. Bernstein. So I followed the low carb diet on my own for the next 7 years. But when I was younger, I had started reading medical texts and nutrition books, and I got convinced that type 1 diabetes could be healed through some kind of natural treatment. So I was always doing research on the next new diet or the next new therapy that I thought would make me healthy enough to heal. So after I'd been on Dr. Bernstein for 7 years, I heard about this woman who had a son who was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, and she fed him a raw vegan diet, and he never had to take insulin. So for the next 7 years, I went on a raw vegan diet. I think I didn't do too bad on it because I never ate fruit and I still did low carb. I had a raw food snack company for 5 years. I was pretty famous in the movement. It was a fun time, but people around me that were in the raw vegan diet and my husband, they were all getting rotten teeth because of how much fruit you eat on this diet and that you're not getting enough nutrients. All I got was sore joints. Lucky me. So then the next 8 years, I found the keto diet, and we decided to eat everything from local farms. So I ate red meat and vegetables and raw butter, and my sore joints went away, and I felt really good on the keto diet. Then, let's see, by the end of the keto diet, I was on about 20 carbs a day, 20 grams of carbs a day, mostly eating fermented vegetables that I had made myself and meat and cheese. But then we were on a trip. My husband and I were teaching art on our long trips when we met you. But this was before that because we somehow were listening to YouTube podcasts. And of course, the famous Joe Rogan podcast with you came up. And then Mikhaila Peterson and Jordan Peterson. We listened to them. My husband, Dennis, went, I'm doing it. So he went carnivore the very next day. Being on a long trip, I was afraid to do it with like what might happen with my insulin requirements and all that kind of stuff. So I did it the day we got back, which was November 12th, 2008. So that'll be my 4-year carniversary.
Okay. Wow. Yeah, go ahead.
So that's pretty good. And I feel better on carnivore than, I have a few issues that cleared up that I didn't even realize, but we can get into that later if you want.
Yeah, well, like I said, you've got a long history with type 2 diabetes, over 50 years, which is, if you look at life expectancy of a type 1 diabetic, you're supposed to be dead by now, basically. It's
right.
That's the truth. That's what we know with the statistics.
Far from it.
And so back at age 22, you went vegetarian. Was that at that time specifically to address type 1 diabetes, or was there some other thing that compelled you to go vegetarian back in your 20s?
I read a few nutrition books that I picked up at the health food store. It was the 70s. It was kind of in. It was kind of the hip thing to do. And I thought that it might help with my health and my diabetes. So I just tried it, and I liked the whole idea of it, of not eating animals. And when I grew up, it's standard American diet. I wanted to improve my health. My dad worked for Swift and Company Meats, and it was just the thing to do.
Yeah, and so you said you basically, essentially, since your diagnosis or shortly thereafter, you haven't really eaten a lot of sugar for your whole life, right? Is that fair to say? Because when you were vegetarian, not eating.
Well, yes, I didn't eat any sugar. I mean, I did before I was diagnosed,
Right.
but I didn't eat any sugar at all. Right.
And it's interesting, that was 1971, and now today, if you type 1 diabetes, they don't really tell you to stop eating sugar. They just say, hey, just, eat it in moderation and hit it with insulin and you're good. Can you talk, because, again, outside of guys like Dr. Richard Bernstein, who has even a longer history, I think he was diagnosed in the 1950s, if I'm not mistaken. He's been dealing with 60 something, 70 years, I think, something like that. The way diabetes has been managed and treated over the years has gone through some dramatic changes. You went to, just the different types of insulin that have come out, the dosing schedules, the monitoring capacity. Now we've got CGMs and pumps and continuous loop, closed loop devices and all kinds of neat stuff that people utilize. But at the end of the day, that technology, if you apply that in the wrong diet, you just end up chasing your tail. When you were trying to, I assume you try to normalize your blood glucose to the best you can. Do you find a difference between a vegetarian style, vegan style versus, say, a low carb, ketogenic, or carnivore style? Is there a difference in insulin requirements or insulin ease of using insulin?
Yes. So when I was vegetarian, we did not have blood sugar testers. We had to test our urine. Mm-hmm. So it was back in the dark ages. I'm sure my blood sugar wasn't great. My first A1C in 1995 was a 6.5, which was actually pretty good for not being able to test my blood. On the ketogenic diet, with low carb diet, it was a lot easier. I had my first 4.9 A1C, but it was still tricky. It was still hard to control my blood sugar. When I went keto, it became a little bit easier. With raw vegan diet, I did a lot of fasting. I just kept thinking I was going to heal. So I did a lot of fasting. Sometimes after a fast, I wouldn't need insulin for a day or two. So I really thought I was going to heal, but it would get, the blood sugars would get low, the insulin would get low, but just not low enough to actually look like I was healing. On the keto diet, I think I had the really good blood sugars on that diet because I ate really high fat. And back then it was really called low carb, high fat. But I actually, when I was trying to find the keto diet, I was trying to figure out how to go on it. I actually found the Zeroing In on Health forum. Yeah. And I found out about carnivore, or, zero carb, before you named it carnivore. I read about Charles Washington. I read about the Andersons. And I thought, these people are crazy. I don't think I could do this. And I wish I had, but I didn't. I did keto for 8 years. So on carnivore, it's still not easy to control my blood sugars. I don't use a CGM. I only use my meter. I don't have a pump. I'm kind of old school like that. I like to keep my expenses down. So I use the old school insulin that I can buy at Walmart for $25 a vial. And I also think that because it's a slower acting insulin, that it matches the carnivore diet much better because the meat is so slow digesting and the insulin is slow to work. So, I've had other benefits from the carnivore diet. My eye floaters, which were getting really bad on keto, completely disappeared. I don't have them at all. And a weird benefit has been that I used to have ear pain. Hush, hush. That's my grand dog. I'm at my son's house because his internet is better than mine. Oh, I used to have ear pain when I flew in airplanes on takeoff and landing, horrible ear pain that I would just cry and I didn't want to fly. And after starting Carnivore, and my husband and I were lucky enough to get to go to Italy and Russia, and I had no ear pain at all. And interestingly enough, the first 6 months that I was Carnivore, I coughed up mucus every day. So I don't know if they're related, but it's pretty interesting.
Yeah, I can't remember anybody saying that specifically, but it's interesting to see what happens. When you, it's interesting because you mentioned the older school insulins, the regular insulin versus the synthetic analogs that we have now, which were basically they're designed for carbohydrate utilization because they have a very rapid, onset, and that's what carbohydrates do. And when you're eating, meat, for instance, the rise in glucose might be very, very slow, and that regular insulin seems to cover it better. So you're using then basically regular and then NPH. Is that how you're doing for your longer stuff? Yeah, I had somebody, I had another type 1 on the other day, the same exact schedule. It was same Carnivore, regular insulin from Walmart, NPH from Walmart. It saves a lot of money, and it dials things in pretty nicely for them. So it's interesting. And I obviously the absorption characteristics through the skin, we're not supposed to, we're not usually getting insulin through an injection in our skin, but it's interesting that the actual human insulin has a longer half-life of effect than the synthetic stuff, which to me is like, well, maybe you're supposed to be eating a diet that matches that pattern too. Although it's, you could argue it's just the absorption characteristics. Do you, as far as, you've got these other things that have improved with Carnivore, do you find that, there's been any negatives or difficulties so far?
Downsides. Let me think.
I mean, the answer can be no. There's nothing wrong with that.
I don't think I have. I love the Carnivore diet. I don't have any trouble going out to eat. I usually get a burger and double bacon. Simple. Mm-hmm. My grocery shopping is really simple. I buy burger and eggs and bacon, usually maybe a piece of meat to put in some variety, like flank and short ribs or stew meat or something. I've tried a lot of different forms of the Carnivore diet. For 3 months, a couple of years ago, I did the lion diet. So I ate lamb and beef only. Mm-hmm. And my insulin requirements went way down, and I thought I was going to be able to stay on it and really improve. But I couldn't stay on it psychologically. It was just so boring. I couldn't do it. I'm going to try again in January to go back on the lion. I only had to take like 4 units of insulin. It was ridiculous, but it still didn't seem like it was going to heal it. And I don't know if that would ever be possible. I have heard of a few type 1s who have gotten off of insulin.
Yeah, I'm familiar with a few folks. I think about a half dozen or so have claimed that they've been off it. And the question is, were they misdiagnosed? Are they really off? I mean, are their beta cells recovering? Are they producing more? There's more C-peptide, all those types of things. We know that even long-term type 1 diabetics still produce a small residual amount of insulin. So it's not as though there's zero. But let's talk about it a little bit, because there's some people who may not know the difference. Type 1, type 2 diabetes. There's more types, just so people don't know. There's several subtypes and different types of that. But in general, type 2 diabetes, usually it's associated with obesity. Usually it's later in life. It used to be called adult onset diabetes. Usually we see people that are overweight and they become insulin resistant. And then basically they can't produce enough insulin to overcome the insulin resistance. And whereas type 1 diabetes, you have kind of primary failure of the insulin secreting beta cells, where they no longer have the full capacity to secrete insulin. Some people assume that they're dead, but I think the real accurate thing, what happens is they become de-differentiated. So they go back to a sort of a nondescript cell. They kind of turn back into almost like a stem cell, if you will, or pluripotent, undifferentiated cell. And so the question, some people say, well, is it possible to coax them back into becoming beta cells again? And that's there's some people doing research on that, but I don't know how promising that is. But, you talk about, when you say healing, I mean, I assume when you say healing, it's you're like, I'm going to fix my type 1 diabetes so that I no longer require insulin. Is that what you mean by healing?
Yeah, that's the idea. Yes.
Well, I mean, like I said, if you can do that, that would be groundbreaking, and I know, like I said, I'm aware of a few people that have made the claims that, hey, I don't use insulin anymore. And that's, fascinating. And I just, I kind of want, like anything, there are probably multiple reasons for type 1 diabetes. There's probably multiple different little subtypes that are going on, and maybe some might be amenable to this at some point. Who knows? I mean, it could be. I mean, certainly we see during the honeymoon period. I mean, I'm sure you're familiar with the work of the Paleomedicine group. They say they claimed, and there's a French group that's also done that. They've duplicated people diagnosed with type 1 diabetes and then not needing insulin for prolonged periods of time by doing this or some version of the diet. You'd mentioned, keto, you're very high fat. On carnivore, are you real high fat, or where are you doing with that? How does your protein and fat come into play? Do you know?
Right now, I am playing with eating a stick of butter a day, just to see what the health benefits might be. But I'll always eat high fat. If I'm not doing the butter every day, I'm doing beef fat trimmings and bacon. So I always try to get a lot of fat because I think it helps the blood sugar to not go up as fast. I believe there's benefits in being in ketosis. So, yeah.
Yeah, when you eat a stick of butter, that's a lot of calories. I mean, some people will say, well, it's just a good way to get fat. If you eat a bunch of calories, big stick of butter.
I'm kind of seeing that. I have gained a few pounds. So the jury is still out on that one.
Yeah, I mean, like critics, a stick of butter is about 800 calories. I mean, I just looked it up real quick. And so it's like, if I'm eating 800 extra, well, I don't know if it's extra calories a day, if it's displacing some. Now, 800 calories in a day is not a big deal if that's all you're eating, but, if it goes from 2,000 calories to 2,800 calories, and then it's above and beyond what your needs are, you could, if you gain body fat, then potentially become more insulin resistant, and then you just kind of chasing your tail. And so it's one of those things where we know that, fat in the meal will mitigate a rise. So if you combine fat with carbs, depending on how much is in there, you may see less of a quick rise because the fat slows down the absorption. But at the end of the day, some people say, well, you may see a smaller rise, but it's a longer rise. And then the area under the curve is the same. And is that causing damage as well? Hard to say. I mean, maybe some people say it's easy to say. I look at body composition being a relatively important marker for what's going on. So if you're eating a stick of butter a day and you gain a bunch of body fat, I would say maybe not the best idea, but you have to see what's
right. I've only been doing it for a couple of weeks, and I'm not sure I'm going to keep it up because I have gained some fat in the wrong place. So, and my blood sugars have been not as good.
Yeah. Well, so you might have the answer.
Yeah, I know. So your theory is pretty much right.
Yeah. Yeah.
And, right.
Yeah. I mean,
I had just heard a podcast with Ivor Cummins talking about having low insulin. And my interpretation for me is that as a diabetic, I want to keep my insulin as low as possible. So even if I'm not going to heal myself, still is the point of keeping my insulin low because I think that is more healthy than not.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's interesting. There's a study that came out looking at type 1 diabetics and looking at insulin usage and cancer rates. And they saw, they categorized them in low, medium, and high insulin usage. And the folks in the high insulin usage had the highest rates of cancer. It significantly increased it. And low was considered was about, half a unit per kilogram. So if you weighed, let's say you weigh 60 kilos or whatever, I'm not sure what you weigh, that would be 30 units a day. Anything below 30 units a day would be considered low. And there's a point where, it's like, you can do a a diet to where you need almost no insulin, but then are you losing muscle? Are you, that's the question, because you need a certain amount to retain the muscle in the tissues. And so there's like, what is low, what is too low? And then of course there's obviously too high. And you know how you can get high, just eat a bunch of sugar and your insulin requirements will go through the roof. And so it's kind of one of those things that, it's always that, is there a good place to be? Is there a too low and a too high? And sometimes, you'd like to say, I don't need insulin anymore because my pancreas is now making its own insulin and I'm cured of diabetes. That's the thing. But is going to eat a pure fat diet the answer? And I don't know. I don't know that it is.
No. And when I was on the Lion diet for 3 months, yes, my insulin requirements went way, way down, but I lost a lot of weight and probably wasn't very healthy.
What was your blood glucose like? Was it good then too?
Oh, my blood glucose was good, but I just had to keep lowering my insulin way down. But I also lost like 8 pounds, which I don't weigh that much anyway. Yeah. So, I weigh 115.
The question is, it's because if you're getting enough protein, you'd assume you're maintaining your lean mass. And, like if you're losing excess body fat, that's not necessarily a bad thing. But at the same point, if you start losing a bunch of lean mass when you don't have much to begin with, that's a problem. So interesting to see. How much were you eating? I mean, maybe you just weren't eating enough food, perhaps.
I may not have been eating because I might not have been eating enough. I was eating 2 lamb chops for breakfast, 2 lamb chops for dinner, and probably a burger or steak for lunch. Okay. I don't know the ounces exactly.
Yeah, I think a lamb chop's about 4 ounces typically or something like that. So you might have been eating.
It's probably eating a pound or a pound and a half of meat a day, I think.
Well, that's probably enough adequate protein.
Enough.
Yeah, at 115 pounds, that's if you're getting 100 pound and a half of meat, then you're getting adequate protein, I would assume. Interesting. Do you find that as far as you said, you have no interest in putting on a CGM? That's kind of because a lot of people find that's really helps them to manage things.
I do have an interest in it. I do think that I would become anxious about having something attached to my body. And the constant alarms might make me anxious. And because I'm 68, I now have Medicare. I wasn't really able to afford it before that. So I'm working on possibly getting one.
Yeah, I think you can silence the alarms. I think some of the only real alarm that you can't silence is a critical low. So if you drop below 50, I think legally they're not allowed to, because danger, Will Robinson, you're going to have a coma. So they're, or something like that. And so obviously, right. Do you have an endocrinologist that oversees you or anything like that?
No. I kind of winged it. I went to a naturopath for many years and then, he stopped practicing, and then I've just been on my own. And recently I started going to a nurse practitioner so I could get labs done because I'm just curious. Yeah. But I've just been doing home A1C tests and pretty much being my own doctor for a pretty long time.
It's kind of funny because, you're basically a type 1 diabetic that, you've been doing it your own without the doctor, and you probably have a better outcome than a lot of people that go to the endocrinologist, to be honest. I mean, just and again, I'm not saying everybody does that, but it's probably, you've probably at 68 and still in good health, you're doing probably better than 90+% of type 1 diabetics that have been out there that have been managed with a traditional system. So good on you for being able to do that. That's pretty interesting. And, it's, like I said, you're the one that has to live with this. You're the one that has to decide, how much insulin do I want to give myself and that type of stuff. So it's a very unique situation because, you've got this medication that could kill you. I mean, you overdose and you're dead. Or you could be dead, and same time if you underdose, because there's a lot of people that there's this concept of diabulimia. And, you just like underdose your insulin and let the blood glucose ride, and you lose weight. I can lose weight. I let my blood glucose hang out around 250, 300 for a couple of weeks, and I'll lose 20 pounds because I'm peeing it all out. I'm peeing all that energy out. I'm not able to take it in my body. And so it's an interesting type of thing. Now, I want to, because I think this is important to talk, because I met your husband, Dennis, and what a wonderful man. And he passed away. He was on the carnivore diet too. And if I'm not mistaken, you told me he ended up having colon cancer and passing away related to that. Am I remembering that correctly?
Yes. In fact, my carniversary is the 12th of November. Mm-hmm. He died last year on the 13th of November. Mm-hmm. There was no celebrating my third year, of course. Yeah. He did die of colon cancer. He had not been diagnosed with irritable bowel syndrome, even though he probably should have been. I think the cancer was probably caused from he just never addressed the health of his colon. He had chronic diarrhea for 30, 40 years. Yeah. Yeah. And started having pain in his gut and was diagnosed with a huge tumor in his colon. And I think the first problem was that the doctors would not allow him to have surgery to take the tumor out. They wanted him to do chemo to shrink the tumor, and living the way we had always lived on a natural diet, he just didn't feel comfortable just jumping into chemotherapy. So we tried a lot of different alternative therapies, ozone treatment, vitamin C drips, sauna, the whole bit. We went to a naturopath who really wasn't very good because he sold him $1,500 worth of supplements. And this guy had a blockage in his colon and he couldn't take supplements. Anyway, he seemed to be getting a little better. And then ultimately the tumor ruptured his colon, and he was given a ostomy bag and was down to 105 pounds and could just he never really recovered from the surgery. Yeah.
Yeah. And you guys were together for how many years? I mean, how many years had you been together?
42 years.
42 years. Did he do the various raw vegan ventures with you? Did he experiment in all those things as well?
Yes, he did.
Yeah. So you guys kind of did that together. So over the years.
Yeah, we did. And
it's interesting, and I don't, you said he was undiagnosed. There's irritable bowel syndrome, and then there's more, sometimes irritable bowel syndrome will progress to inflammatory bowel disease, which is Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis. Maybe he'd gotten to that. And we certainly know when someone has inflammatory bowel disease, their risk for colorectal cancer goes up something like 3,000%. It's a huge increase. And so, perhaps that was going on for years and years. And I know he, because when I had dinner with you guys, I know you'd just started doing carnivore relatively not that long ago when he was in town. And he was a really sort of a prolific painter. He had all these neat paintings and was quite talented at painting. And I'm not much of an art guy, but they look nice to me anyway. But I was very sad to hear about that. But did that, because of course you got to say, well, I'm on a carnivore diet and I died of colon cancer, but it sounds like it may have been there for, who knows, it might have been decades in the making. Did that cause you to pause and say, maybe this isn't the right thing for me? Was that something that you thought?
I guess it crossed my mind, but I had heard so many testimonials and I believed them that I never doubted that it was right for me. I mean, for a split second, I thought about it. And I was worried that some of our friends would accuse us of having the wrong diet. Everybody's been amazing, and I've never had anybody say anything about it. They might be thinking it, but they've never said anything to me. So I've just believed the testimonials.
Yeah.
So.
Well, like I said, and we are trying, and I'll share this with the rest of the group since I found out the other day. I know there's going to be another. We are collecting data to do studies on aspects of the carnivore diet. Particularly, we're looking at, from a cost saving standpoint, because I think that's an important thing for healthcare entities to make that decision based on cost, because that's what they do basically. But there will be another study coming out, a pretty large, well-funded study, I believe. I'm hearing rumors of this, looking at carnivore diet and autoimmune conditions, which would be really nice to see an interventional trial done in that regard. And so, as we get more data, because a lot of people say, well, it's just anecdotes. And, when you get to the 50,000th anecdote, you're like, well, maybe there's something here. I mean, I've been seeing this stuff for years. I see it every day. So I'm pretty convinced that there is potential for benefit here for sure. And so as a type 1 diabetic, are you in contact with other type 1s? Are you seeing anybody else? Have people asked you questions? Have they tried it? What's been your experience?
I am in quite a few type 1 diabetic Facebook groups. Mm-hmm. And we have a type 1 diabetic carnivore group mm-hmm. on Facebook. And I don't hold back. I mean, I'm on type 1 grit, and I'll say I'm a carnivore. I eat 0 carb, because I don't think it really is contradictory to Dr. Bernstein's
no, I don't think so.
30 grams of carbs a day. It's just less than what he says. Mm-hmm. So I fully admit it. I don't think anybody's ever argued with me about it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and if you're putting up consistently hemoglobin A1Cs, 5, 4, high 4s, low 5s, that's hard to argue with from a diabetic standpoint. Because if you look at the ADA's goals, I mean, it's like, just get it under 7. And they're like, oh God, you got under 7, you're great, no big deal. It's 6.9, you're good, you're good, no problems. And whereas that's still not a normal blood glucose. And are there problems? And I think a lot of them, the endocrinologists. Like I heard people like Dr. Ryan Attar, I believe I interviewed him. He's a physician with a type 1 diabetic situation, and he'll roll in with a hemoglobin A1C of 4.7, and the doctor will say, well, that's too low. I'm worried it's too low for you, because I think they're worried about that maybe you're experiencing too many hypoglycemic episodes, and you right, because you could sit there and be hypoglycemic all day long, keep pumping in insulin and be. But are you experiencing a lot of hypoglycemic episodes? Is that something that you get very often?
Not recently. I have while I'm on the carnivore diet, my blood sugars will go into the 30s and 40s. Right now, I seem to be controlling it a little better, although my A1C suffered the last couple of ones. Were in the 6s. I don't like to admit it, but they were. So I think actually the butter is probably causing my A1C to be higher. Like you said, you explained it very well. But I have lows, I have highs. Maybe I do need the CGM. Who knows?
Well, I mean, the people will say, because they can start to see as soon as it starts to go up, they can say, okay, I need just a little touch of insulin to kind of smooth out that curve so it doesn't rise. Or if it starts drifting down, you'll say it'll be 70 and then 65, and they'll say, okay, I need to correct that somehow, so you can kind of keep it between the lines on the bumpers a little better than what about appetite? Because this is something that I know it from me, when I was eating carbs, they drive my appetite. Like, I can, if I just eat meat and fat, I don't want anything. I'm good. I don't, but if there's a time where I have a carbohydrate, then all of a sudden I'm hungry again. I'm like, wow, I'm just hungry all the time. And sometimes it takes several days to sort of fix that. I don't know. Do you notice a difference in appetite, satiety, and things like that with carnivore or keto compared to vegan, vegetarian?
I think that hunger is an interesting thing. I eat 3 meals a day. I don't really get hungry. I don't snack. I kind of think that maybe my hunger hormones broke a long time ago. I'm happy to eat when I eat, but it's not like, it's very unusual for me to be actually hungry. So I don't know. I've heard that from a lot of diabetics.
That they're
I'm not really sure why, but
you've heard that they're not hungry. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, but they don't have hunger pains.
Outside of, like you said, you're outspoken. You're not afraid to admit, hey, I'm a carnivore on type 1 diabetes, which is good for you. I mean, I don't think anybody should be ashamed of that. It's something I say, hey, look, I'm actually doing something to improve my health. I'm not eating all the junk food, which a lot of diabetics still are, unfortunately. Do you ever mingle in these sort of so-called, the sort of generalized type 1 diabetes group where they're doing a little everything, where they're following the ADA? Have you had any experience with those particular forums?
I don't go on those Facebook groups because I know it would be too upsetting for me and they would throw me out anyway. If you go on a regular type 1 diabetic Facebook group, if you say the word low carb or you mention Dr. Bernstein, they kick you out. So I don't do that.
Interesting.
I do have I'm very active on Instagram and on Facebook, and I mention my diabetes all the time and the way I eat and all that kind of stuff. And I've had a few comments of criticism, but not many. Come here. Quit crying.
Yeah, he wants maybe he's hungry. Maybe he wants something to eat.
She's got a little anxiety.
Oh, okay. Okay. So as far as, if you were diagnosed with diabetes today, either type 1 or type 2, what would you do? What recommendations would you have for someone?
Well, I get that question a lot, actually, but I would go directly onto a carnivore diet. And I'd try that first.
Yeah. What is your dosing regimen now for, a carnivore diet? Because there's like something called a Warsaw formula where you dose for protein and fat, and there's different. Some people say you dose protein half as much as you dose for carbs. How successful are you at determining that and matching that up pretty well? And what's your thought process? If I eat a half, and I don't know what it's typical. If I eat 2 lamb chops, how much insulin do I need for that?
I'd take 1 unit of R. So I have been doing this for so long on my own that, I figure out my basal, which is the basal is what you take just to be alive.
Right.
You don't have, even if you were going to fast, you'd still have to take basal to stay alive.
Right.
And so the MPH I take twice a day, and I take 7 units in the morning and 2.5 at night. And that keeps me pretty regular whether I'm going to eat or not.
Okay.
And then at breakfast, I eat 2 eggs and 2 or 3 slices of bacon. And that's 1 unit of our insulin, our regular. At lunch, I eat maybe a burger and a couple of pieces of bacon. And that's 1 to 1.5 units, depending on what my blood sugar was before I started eating. And I usually don't take my insulin until after I eat.
Yeah. So you know what you've eaten, so there's no guesswork. Some people.
Well, right, and plus it takes longer, but so does the meat. So you have to figure out, you've got to match the insulin to the meat. So it just works to take your insulin after you eat.
Yeah,
so then at supper, I might eat some flank and short ribs. And they, I guess at how much it looks like on my plate, and it's either 1 or 2 or 2.5 units of insulin.
Okay. So you're so overall throughout the day with the basal and the bolus combo, you're 13, 14 units, something like that. So,
13 to 15 units of insulin.
Yeah, that's not very much. Considering you said you weighed 105, so you're just you're just under 50, you're about 50 kilos, and so you're certainly below that half, that low range, which would be 25 units. And so that would be, so you're definitely in the lower ranges of insulin utilization for a type 1 diabetic. And so that's, again, I think there's some sense in, you want to keep your blood glucose low and use as little insulin as you need to do that. But at the same time, you have to make sure you have enough insulin to, like you mentioned, if you take no basal, your body would just melt into a pile of glucose. All your muscles would just disintegrate because your body would eventually just, take everything away because you have nothing everything's catabolism. There's no anabolism because insulin allows for that. So we have insulin that allows. That's why bodybuilders, in fact, will use it as a drug cheating. They'll inject themselves with insulin to build their muscles, which is, kind of crazy. I remember when I was in medical school, this is, many, many years ago, and I was training at the gym, and I remember there was a young kid that was shooting up insulin to try to, and I was like, you're crazy. I was just barely, I knew enough to know that could be very dangerous. I said, why are you doing it? Because you could very easily overdose on that and end up, laying on the ground seizing and potentially end up dead. So interesting with that.
Yeah, I could not imagine doing that on purpose.
Have you ever had because this is over 50 years, have you ever had an episode where you had to be rescued, where, you got so low that somebody had to hit you with glucagon or anything like that?
Nope. I've never been into DKA and I've never passed out.
Yeah.
I don't know why, but I think, being on, being low carb for so long, it's the law of small numbers, and it really works.
Yeah, that's a Dr. Bernstein thing. So because there's some people that'll eat a meal and they'll give themselves 25 units of insulin to cover it. It's just like,
can't imagine.
And it's like, it's like 2 days worth for you, and that's for one meal for them. And if they overestimate by 20%, now they're sitting there with a blood glucose of 37, and then they're hypoglycemic, and then they're like, I got to give me some candy because I need to come back up.
Mm-hmm.
And then they go up too high and then they have to get more insulin. It's just bizarre that we do that. And, I think Dave Dykman, which I guess I should get Dave Dykman and his kids on here. I'm sure you know Dave Dykman.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And, because he's his kid, they talk about, how the exact same thing is if you look at the absorption characteristics of an insulin analog, a Humalog, for instance, you can't match that to meals very well. And if you're off by 15 minutes, that's peaking and dropping while the other stuff is peaking and you're missing it. So you're just kind of chasing your tail. You never hit it accurately. So it's so hard. So when you have these smoother, longer peaks, even if they're not timed exactly right, you're still going to get 80, 90% coverage. Whereas if you miss the peak on one that's going to be in and out in 30 minutes and you're off by 15, half the time you're not even covering yourself. So it's kind of an interesting concept.
It's a lot trickier than most people think. Most people think, oh, you're diabetic, you can take insulin. And that's all they think. And they think it's some kind of magic where it just matches and it's easy.
Yeah.
But it is not easy. It's like so complex.
Yeah. Well, it's like if you imagine, you had to control your lungs, like you had to think about when you needed to breathe. And then you're like, well, it's sitting at rest. I'm going to take a breath every 12, 14 seconds, or every 12 to 14 times a minute. Okay, but what happens if I get excited? What happens if I exercise? All these things go on, and you're like, I've got to think about when to breathe. It's because you're replacing an organ in your body that's instantaneously and constantly reflecting feedback. And it's not just meals. It's, how well did I sleep? It's, am I stressed out that day? Because, you get stressful information. Do I have a cold? It's kind of interesting. You get sick, and then all of a sudden your blood glucose is super high, and you're like,
or recently I've learned that grief is one of the worst things for blood sugar.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, stress. Stress.
It is one of the worst stress. It happened when my sister died several years ago. I could not look at a picture of her without my blood sugar going up to 200.
Yeah. It's crazy.
I deal with living on my own and being a widow every day. And it's no surprise that I've had a harder time with my blood sugars.
Yeah, it's there's it's kind of interesting because when I was taking care of patients in the hospital and they were diabetic, we would just routinely throw them on a sliding scale. I mean, it was just, it was just like, it's like, if it's 140 to 180, you give them 2 units. And if it was two at 180 to 220 to give them 4 units, it's just some slide, something. And as an orthopedic surgeon, I never managed diabetes. Okay, what's the formula here? Stick it in there, and you just automatically do it without thinking about it. I used to hate those things because I was like, I don't know anything about diabetes. And then, but you think about why were we doing that? And it was like, well, we know that if you're in the hospital. So there's one study. It's interesting. There was one small study that was done looking at diabetes and blood sugar concentrations in the during trauma, burn patients and stuff like that. And they showed that if you lower their blood glucose in the hospital, they do tend to they do better. However, the interesting thing was that study was very small and was never really duplicated. So all this policy was based on this one particular study, and they didn't have any good duplication studies. And there's this concept of stress hyperglycemia. So when you're stressed out, your body produces more glucose. And why is that? One of the things it does is there's some level of evidence that our immune system actually works better in that situation, which is kind of weird. So when we get a cold, why would our body shoot up our glucose? And is there something that the macrophages work better? So some people question whether that is actually the right approach. Particularly in maybe in a non-diabetic situation, or even, so it's not, I don't think it's clipped forward. So like, I know some people, they'll get sick when they're diabetic, they'll have a cold and they can't take enough insulin to get it down. It's like it never goes down. They're hitting themselves with more and more insulin, and your body's just saying, we're going to keep that blood glucose up. And I think there's a reason for that. So it's interesting to see that. And, I know some physicians tell people just keep it under 180. Don't worry about the 120. Just keep it under 180. You don't need to get it back down to normal in that stressful situation. So it's kind of weird. It's kind of weird. Like exercise. I know, like I'm wearing a CGM right now, just for fun, just kind of fun stuff. And I know my highest glucose is when I exercise. I mean, it'll start getting up 130, 140. I've seen 180 after really intense exercise. And I'm like, is that bad for me? Am I killing myself, or is that a normal physiologic response? And so it's kind of an interesting situation. Aimee, we are unfortunately running out of time. I want to thank you for that. It's good to see you again. And once again, condolences for Dennis passing away, but keep being a positive role model. And I know you're strong and you're going to keep going. I think you're going to be here another 20, 30 years and continue to be strong. And, I'm sure we'll learn some more stuff as time goes by, as this crazy carnivore thing becomes more and more mainstream, which I have no doubt it will. People like you who were one of the early adopters that have tested these things, it's going to benefit, just countless people, I'm sure, down the road. So good for you. You said you're on social media and you like to talk on social media. Would you mind sharing where you're located?
Sure. So I'm on Facebook and Instagram. And it's Aimee Fields Perrin. So AIMEEFIELDS I just decided to do my name and that's it. So that's what I am on both.
Perfect. Okay. And are you, I couldn't remember, you do some kind, are you painting as well? I can't remember what you had another.
I do paint. I paint still life. When my husband was alive, I was his model. So I've been in thousands of paintings. Kept me in good shape, and they are on his Instagram. He was a very famous flower painter mostly, and I videoed all of his courses. So he has several courses that are still for sale, and I keep his Instagram account going as well. So he's Dennis Perrin Fine Art, if you want to look him up so you can see the paintings that I'm in.
Okay.
Or look at his art if you like art.
Okay. Well, thank you, Aimee, and good to see you again. I wish you the best, and look forward to hearing from you down the road again and see how you're doing, okay? Thank you so much. All right.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed it.
Sure. Okay, everybody, we'll be back. I'll be back tomorrow. Well, no, I won't be back tomorrow. I'm actually shooting a documentary tomorrow. Some people are coming out to film me, so I think Felice is going to take over tomorrow. But I'll be back Sunday. You guys have a great Saturday. I'll see you guys Sunday. Bye, everybody. Take care, Aimee. Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.